Welcome to the PEEEEEW paragraph instruction tutorial. Today we're going to learn some very specific instructions to improve our writing. By following these steps, we will not only have better organization, but we will also develop our points more clearly and thoroughly. And once we learn the formula, we can loosely rearrange its components as long as we're following the basic steps. So as a teacher, when I inform students of their writing assignments, I seldom receive cheers and excitement in return. I get it. Writing is hard work, so I hereby grant permission to give every paragraph of every writing assignment from now on the ultimate sign of disrespect. Let me explain. Once my daughter had a cockatiel as a pet, and one day she put that bird on top of her daddy's head, and the bird had previously been trained to pee and poop on demand. And before I could stop what was happening, I watched that bird poop on purpose on my husband's head. And while I went about as quickly as I could cleaning it up while trying not to laugh, my husband says, with a very straight face and tightly clenched teeth, that is the ultimate sign of disrespect. So today we're going to learn how to pee on every paragraph in a paper. So each writing step of the writing process will follow this acrostic, which will spell P-woo, because we will have plenty clearly to say to develop your ideas. It's going to be a long P, and at the risk of getting too personal, after a really extensive release of urine, many of us might utter a sign of relief like that W at the end. Whew, if you will, like, I'm glad that's over. So P stands for preview. We all know that someone who comes up to us out of the blue and says something random, and we don't want to be that guy. Instead, we want to have at least one key word or phrase that signals what our paragraph is going to be about. And that means I'm assuming that your paragraphs are already going to be organized around one main idea each that supports our main points, because they should be. The intention of a paragraph is the reader's subconscious message that the writer is moving on to the next major point. And that's why we have paragraphs, see? So let's pretend that we're writing a paragraph, a paragraph about vaping. And the main point of this body paragraph explores whether or not vaping is a safe alternative to cigarettes for teens. So here's our preview sentence. Teens may believe that vaping is a safer alternative to cigarette smoke, but recently studies show vaping poses many dangers to the teenage consumer especially. So what phrase would indicate the subject of this paragraph? We actually have two. We have safer alternative, and we have many dangers to the teenage consumer, because we want to show that while it seems safer, vaping is actually just as dangerous. So our first sentence should preview the topic. Think preview like the preview to a movie in a theater. It gives a hint of what the paragraph is going to address. So after our preview, the next thing we should give is an example. Examples are important because they are necessary to prove your point. I know that sounds kind of dumb, but often students will write vague assumptions without proof. They don't realize that they're asking their reader to believe them, because they don't realize they're operating on their own vague assumptions. Examples should be specific pieces of evidence, not what you've picked up by your own empirical evidence throughout your life. It's also important to vary the type of evidence that you are using. Throughout our entire paper, we will need a variety of ethos, pathos, and logos. Too much emotion and no facts won't convince your toughest critics, and a long string of facts alone won't tug at the heartstrings of your reader. A good balance, however, will prove more convincing to those who have not considered your side of the argument. And finally, if we use a quote, which should be reserved for the most part to establish your ethos, we should be sure to embed our quote into our sentence correctly. So you'll want to review the lesson that we've done in the past on ties if you need to, and be sure to correctly cite our source. After our example, we can't assume that our readers know why we're telling them our example. This is the most common mistake that smart writers make, who accidentally expect their readers to draw the same silent conclusions that they did without spelling out those conclusions clearly. We will also want to write at least an average of 2 sentences explaining our example. And it's during those two sentences that we will directly support the thesis of our paper. If we don't know what to write about during our explanation sentences, we'll just ask ourselves how the example proves our point. This explanation should further the ethos, pathos, and logos established in our example. Finally, it's fine if our explanation either leads to our example or either follows the example. It depends on what we're trying to say as to how it works best. The main thing is that we have both the example and the explanation. So let's take a look at our sample paragraph as it is evolving by our PEEEEEEW steps. I have written the following 3 sentences to include an example and its explanation. So it says, one concern is that vapes are marketed to teens specifically with flavors like unicorn poop and bubblegum. These teenage targeted flavors add additional toxins to the smoking experience. Professor of Pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco, and lead researcher Mark Rubenstein notes that when these liquids are heated to vapor, cancerous toxic compounds are formed and are formed in the highest quantities in fruit-flavored options. This added danger may thereby make vaping even more toxic to a teen who chooses the flavored e-cigarette than it is for the adult who attempts to switch to vaping as a pathway to end his or her nicotine addiction. So which sentence in this continuation of our paragraph include the actual example? They all run together a little bit, and that's okay. But the main point of my example is that expert Mark Rubenstein asserts that these teen-targeted flavors cause toxins. Notice how I included Rubenstein's credentials, thus establishing ethos or credibility of my source. Also notice how I included the citation at the end of the sentence that would match the first word of the works cited entry on my works cited page at the end of my paper. Now, how did I know what to write about in my explanation sentences, which happen to come before and after my example in this situation? Remember that the main point of my paragraph is that vaping is not a safer alternative to smoking. So, I established that, as you see in the first blue sentence, that unicorn poop and bubblegum are whimsical flavors that are more likely to attract a teenage girl than it would, say, a 45-year-old man who doesn't intend to have to turn in his man card when his buddies see a selection of vape flavors. Instead, I want to guide my readers thinking to see how these flavors are intended for a teenage audience. I say, one concern is that vapes are marketed to teens specifically with flavors like unicorn poop and bubblegum, because I'm writing about vaping in a teenage demographic specifically. Now let's turn our attention to the explanation sentences that follow my example by saying, this added danger may thereby make vaping even more toxic to a teen who chooses the flavored e-cigarettes than it is for a teen who attempts to switch to vaping as a pathway to end his or her nicotine addiction. I am emphasizing the point of my paragraph further that vaping is not a safer alternative. Now that I have given my first set of example and explanation, I've got to repeat the entire process. One example is never enough to prove your point. If a young man's girlfriend asks him why he loves her and all he can come up with is, well, you're really hot, she's probably not going to be very happy with him. She expects a list, right? Like her awesome beauty, intelligence, sense of humor, personality, amazing talent, and the same is true for a paragraph. One reason is not enough. So we start that second example. We also need to clue your reader in that we're transitioning to another example with a word or phrase such as furthermore, however, therefore. Then we want to do the exact same thing as before. We want to continue to be specific and continue to use our ethos, pathos, and logos. Once again, if we use a quote, we want to embed it in our sentence correctly and be sure to cite it. The same is true for the explanation of our second sentence. We've got to let the reader know what's going on in our heads. We've got to support that thesis clearly. We've got to continue our ethos, pathos, and logos and structure our use of example and explanation in the order that makes the most sense to our reader. So in our example, I'm going to use the transitional word however. However, many teens believe that because some vapes do not contain nicotine, it's a safer alternative to smoking. I'm using however because I'm going to introduce my example by acknowledging the argument of someone who may disagree with me. By acknowledging what may be dancing around in my opponent's head, I'm emphasizing the importance of my next example. My next example is shown here in pink. It says, yet studies have shown that most teens are not opting for the vapes without nicotine, and significantly, the urine of those who use vapes without nicotine still have significant levels of toxic compounds present in their urine. I have purposefully used the logos in this example to refute the argument that vapes without nicotine are a safer alternative. Number one, they aren't smoked as frequently as the nicotine vapes. And number two, vapes with and without nicotine are both significantly toxic. The use of logos allows my explanation that follows, as seen here in blue, to support my thesis clearly. This research shows that it's misleading for a teen to believe that vaping is safe. To dance on the edge of a 100-foot cliff and celebrate the fact that the cliff is not 200 feet tall is similar logic of any teen who claims the rite of passage to vaping just because it is not perceived as toxic as the cigarettes of their parents' generation. The first sentence clearly interprets my example. Vaping isn't safe. The second sentence makes the comparison of dancing near a still deadly but shorter cliff to illustrate that the idea of less toxic doesn't mean less dangerous. It's still toxic. In review, begin with a preview, explain a specific example, repeat the process with another example, and then, because it's been a long P, wrap it up. We need a sentence at the end of the paragraph that brings your main idea to a close. Think of this as our mini mic drop and use that space to clearly support the thesis of your paper. Think, how does the point of this paragraph support the main point of the entire paper? And if we're still wondering about what to write, then we can think about what our two examples have in common and say something about their similarities. Chances are we'll say something original that supports our thesis, and typically we should avoid ending with an additional quotation or example. This can make it seem like our paragraph ends abruptly without any thoughts to pull it all together. So let's think about what our two examples have in common. The first one in pink is about how our teen marketed flavors are dangerous. The second one is about how even vapes without nicotine cause just as much toxins in the urine as those without. In short, my examples support that vaping is dangerous, but if that's all I'll say, I'll just be saying the same thing I've already said. So let's think. If teens believe that something that is dangerous is safe, that compounds the problem. Aha! Now I found something worthy to be the focus of my wrap it up sentence. So I'm going to say, the fact that vaping is touted by many to be the new safer teen rebellion may be the reason it is indeed a dangerous fad. That drives the point of my paragraph home. The problem is not just that vaping is not safe. The problem is that teens think it is safe and will therefore develop a habit in ignorance. In the formula, we have options of how to structure the sentences in the middle. We can lead to our example with explanation and follow it with more explanation afterwards. We can give the examples first, as you see in pink, and then follow up with our explanation. And then finally, we could, if we wanted to, give our examples after we introduce it with explanation. The point is that the paragraph should start with a preview, contain at least two well-developed examples, and then conclude with a wrap-it-up mic drop moment that clearly explains what our examples prove, the overall point of our paper. Never before has disrespect been such a beautiful thing. Happy peeing, y'all.